Welcome, curious minds, to another deep dive. Today we're navigating a global landscape that feels, well, particularly turbulent. From geopolitical escalations shaping Europe to widespread civic unrest and some truly heartbreaking human stories emerging directly from conflict zones. It's a world in flux, definitely. And our goal here is to help you cut through some of the noise and really make sense of it all. We've got a pretty fascinating stack of sources for this one, everything from YouTube analysis of recent attacks to detailed reports on protests and a really in-depth investigative piece. Our mission, like always, is to pull out those vital nuggets of knowledge, connect the dots so you walk away feeling well-informed, maybe even with some unexpected aha moments.
Precisely. Yeah, we'll start by looking at the intensifying situation in Ukraine and the unprecedented direct involvement we've actually seen from NATO members recently. Then we'll shift our focus over to the streets of France, where internal pressures seem to be reaching, well, a boiling point. And finally, we head to the Mediterranean for two very different, but I think equally vital stories coming out of Gaza. It's really a journey into the complex nuances of our interconnected world, and it kicks off with quite a striking escalation in Eastern Europe.
Okay, let's dive right into that then. The latest on the Russia-Ukraine conflict, because the scale of these recent Russian attacks is truly staggering. Ukrainian regional authorities reported a massive wave of strikes. We're talking at least 29 dead, 30 wounded across the country in just a 24-hour period. The Ukrainian Air Force gave some specifics: 415 drones, 42 cruise missiles, and 1 Iskander ballistic missile launched. That's a lot.
It is. And what's crucial to understand here, I think, is the challenge of verification in wartime. So while Ukrainian air defenses claim they intercepted, an impressive 386 drones and 27 cruise missiles, President Zelensky himself actually confirmed that 21 drones and 16 missiles did reach their targets across 17 different places and 15 regions. It just highlights this consistent issue in conflict reporting, right? Ukrainian authorities understandably often avoid giving specifics on military targets hit, citing security. So it leaves us with a somewhat incomplete picture of the actual impact. It kind of blurs the lines between what's stopped and what gets through.
Right. And adding a really critical layer to this recent wave of attacks saw Polish forces confirm shooting down Russian drones that violated their airspace. Now, that marks a significant escalation. Kyiv even reported that at least 8 of those Russian drones were actually targeting Poland. President Zelensky framed this as a deliberate Russian strategy. He said, Moscow always tests the limits of what is possible, and if it doesn't find a strong reaction, it remains at a new level of escalation.
That's a really profound statement. And the incident itself carries immense geopolitical weight, obviously. I mean, this is the first time a NATO member has actually fired during this war. You had Polish military aircraft supported by Polish F-16s, Dutch F-35s, Italian AILA-2CS surveillance planes. Those are the airborne warning and control system aircraft, are really critical for spotting aerial threats. And NATO refueling aircraft, too. They all participated. The Polish prime minister even stated this was the closest Poland has been to open conflict since World War II. That's huge. Although he did also wisely caution, that he saw no reason to believe they were actually on the verge of war. That nuance is incredibly important for understanding NATO's, strategic tightrope walk here.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you might expect, Moscow pretty swiftly denied responsibility. A senior Russian diplomat in Poland, Andrei Ordak, claimed the drones came from Ukraine's direction and that Poland hadn't presented any proof they were Russian. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov didn't comment directly on this incident, but kind of broadly stated that EU and NATO leaders accuse Russia of provocations daily, often without even trying to present any kind of argument. Sort of a deflection. Meanwhile, Polish Prime Minister Tusk classified the incident as a large-scale provocation and, in response, activated Article 4 of the NATO treaty.
Okay, and this brings us to a really critical distinction that sort of defines NATO's response mechanism. Activating Article 4 basically means member states will consult whenever the territory, political independence, or security of any member is threatened. These discussions can lead to joint decisions or actions. It's actually been invoked 7 times since NATO was created, most recently after the Ukraine war started in 2022. But it's crucial, really crucial, to distinguish this from Article 5. That's the cornerstone, right? An armed attack against one is an attack against all, requiring collective defense. Article 5 has only been activated once after 9/11. So the key insight here, according to one source, is that NATO is not treating this Polish incident as an attack that triggers Article 5. They're framing it as an intentional incursion. And that deliberate classification reflects, I think, that strategic tightrope walk we mentioned. It's a showing of force and unity to deter, but without triggering the full collective defense mechanism that could lead to a much wider direct confrontation.
That makes sense. For the Polish people, though, the immediate impact was quite tangible, right? The operational command of the Polish armed forces asked residents, particularly in 3 eastern regions, to stay home for a period. Several Polish airports were temporarily closed, including one that's been a main hub for Western officials and supplies going into Ukraine. NATO Chief Mark Rutte didn't mince words either. He said regardless of intent, the act was absolutely imprudent, absolutely dangerous, unquote. And like you said, we've seen Russian missiles or drones dip into neighboring airspaces before, but maybe not on this scale, and they hadn't actually been shot down by NATO forces previously. Unlike that tragic incident in 2022 where a Ukrainian air defense missile unfortunately killed 2 people in Poland.
So, was this incursion actually intentional? That's the big question. The EU's chief diplomat, Kaja Kallas, certainly seems to think so. She posted on X, formerly Twitter, that initial signs suggest the entry of Russian drones was intentional. She argued that Russia's war is escalating, not ending, and that allies need to increase the cost for Moscow, strengthen support for Ukraine, and invest in Europe's defense. Strong words. And the president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, echoed calls for more sanctions against Russia. She specifically mentioned measures against the ghost fleet tankers. Those are basically vessels operating under the radar, no proper insurance or registration, used to covertly ship Russian oil and get around international sanctions.
Interesting. And when we look at the Russian press coverage, there's like almost no mention of the Poland incident directly. Very quiet. However, we did find a report from the Russian Defense Ministry that seemed like maybe a subtle counter-narrative. It affirmed that Russian FPV drone teams, those first-person view drones often used for kamikaze attacks, had destroyed 4 Polish-made fly reconnaissance drones used by the Ukrainian army. They even put out a video. Plus, the Russians gave their version of those night attacks, stating they conducted a massive strike with precision weapons and UAVs against Ukrainian military-industrial targets, claiming all designated targets were hit. So, you really have 2 very different stories about the same night of events. Okay, so while Europe is grappling with this really high-stakes situation on its eastern flank, internal pressures are also, well, boiling over elsewhere. Let's turn our attention now to France, where President Macron is facing a very different kind of challenge, this time on the streets. On Wednesday, you had protesters across the country taking to the streets, expressing anger against him, the political class in general, and planned budget cuts.
Yeah, the situation there sounds quite volatile. Protesters were interrupting traffic, burning trash bins, clashing with police in some areas. The government responded pretty forcefully, deploying tens of thousands of security forces, aiming to remove blockades quickly. And despite some confrontations, authorities were saying France wasn't completely paralyzed, though almost 300 protesters were arrested nationwide. It really highlights the challenge for Macron. How do you manage this kind of public dissent while trying to push forward with what are clearly unpopular economic policies?
And the anger seems very much directed at Macron himself, doesn't it? He's already navigating a political crisis after the opposition in parliament tried to bring down his government just days before these protests. He just recently named a close ally, the conservative Sebastian Lecornu, as the new prime minister. But Lecornu faces the exact same daunting challenge as his predecessor, getting a handle on France's growing national debt. A representative from the CGT union, that's one of France's biggest unions, put it pretty bluntly at a Paris protest. It's the same thing. The problem is Macron, not the ministers. He has to go.
And that really eliminates, I think, a pattern we're seeing in quite a few Western democracies right now. This deep growing disconnect between citizens and the political establishment. Even reforms that might be argued as necessary are often perceived as direct attacks on public welfare or services. Macron, despite technically leading a center-left coalition, has often appointed right-wing prime ministers. This has led to a parliament that really struggles to pass policies or govern effectively. There's gridlock. We saw reports of police using tear gas against young people blocking a high school in Paris, firefighters dealing with burning barricades. In Rennes, the interior minister, Bruno Retailleau, reported protesters torched buses, attacked police with cobblestones. He also warned that left-wing rallies could be infiltrated by, quote, far-left groups and turn violent. It feels like a barometer for the fragility of the social contract, really, across the continent, far beyond just Macron's government.
Yeah, it does. And this total blockade movement, which kind of ironically apparently originated online back in May among right-wing groups, has now been pretty enthusiastically adopted by the left, who are just as frustrated with these proposed cuts. A lot of people are already drawing comparisons to the Yellow Vest protests back in 2018, remember those? Started over fuel prices, but quickly morphed into a much broader anti-Macron movement.
Absolutely. And the core grievance, undoubtedly, is the budget cuts. They touch everything: public services, social welfare. A professor protesting in Paris summed it up well. He said he was against the cuts planned by the former prime minister and argued, look, if the PM was removed, his policies should go too. He demanded more funding for schools and hospitals. And in other cities like Nantes and Montpellier, you saw similar scenes. Protesters blocking highways, setting fires, often met with police tear gas. It's just a clear signal of widespread discontent that seems to be crossing those traditional political divides.
Okay, so transitioning from these big political and social currents, let's navigate now to the Mediterranean. Here we find another layer of tension, but this time focused more on humanitarian efforts and the direct human cost of conflict. An international flotilla of activists attempting to break the Israeli blockade on Gaza reported being attacked for the second night in a row.
That's right. They claim a drone targeted one of their boats, the British-flagged Alma, while it was anchored in Tunisian waters. Fortunately, reports say no one was injured. The flotilla, called Global Samud, actually shared security camera footage. It shows people on the boat yelling "fire," pointing up at the sky as these flaming projectiles fall into the deck, explode, and start a small fire. It certainly spotlights the ongoing and often quite dangerous attempts to challenge or circumvent the Gaza blockade.
Yeah, it sounds pretty scary. Tiago Avila, who is a Brazilian activist and a spokesman for the flotilla, described it. A drone came and launched another incendiary device. Fortunately, it was contained without structural damage to our boat, without injuries to our team, and we continue our mission to break the siege on Gaza. They also posted a photo online of a sort of carbonized object they say caused the fire. And this attack sounds very similar to one the previous night against another ship, the Portuguese-flagged Family. Both these boats are described as motherships for the mission, basically providing support, provisions, and apparently transporting some prominent members like Swedish activist Greta Thunberg and the former mayor of Barcelona, Ada Colau. That certainly adds to the symbolic weight of these efforts.
Definitely. And the broader significance of these flotillas, I think, lies in their persistent challenge to the blockade itself. They draw international attention, they attempt to force some kind of humanitarian opening, often at considerable personal risk to those involved. They really represent a continuous non-military form of resistance and attempted aid delivery, highlighting the enduring human impact of the blockade.
And from those symbolic efforts to deliver aid, we now have to delve into an even more harrowing examination of the immediate human cost and, frankly, the moral dilemmas on the ground in Gaza itself. This next story comes from a 5-month investigation by a consortium of really reputable outlets: The Guardian, Eric Paper, Tay Media, Germany's Der Spiegel, and ZDF Public Television. And it uncovers what they describe as a deeply disturbing pattern of killings by Israeli troops. Specifically, the investigation identified 6 people shot by Israeli snipers on one day, November 22, 2023. It tragically reveals how one family, the Dugmas family in Gaza City, was torn apart in just a matter of hours, 4 members killed, 2 injured.
Yeah, this investigation points to something deeply troubling. Israeli troops reportedly treating unarmed men, basically between 18 and 40, in Gaza as legitimate targets. The reporting centers quite heavily on one individual, Daniel Rab, who's apparently a former basketball player turned Israeli sniper. And according to the report and video evidence, he showed no hesitation while watching drone footage of 19-year-old Salem Digmos falling to the ground next to his brother. Rab is quoted as saying, "That was my first elimination."
It's chilling. And Rab reportedly admitted he knew the teenager was apparently unarmed. He stated he shot Salem simply because the young man tried to retrieve the body of his older brother, Mohammed, who had already been killed. In a video interview included in the investigation, Rob Chillingley says, "It's hard for me to understand why he did that, and I don't really care much. I mean, what was so important in that corpse?" After Salem was shot, their 51-year-old father, Montasser, rushed to the site, trying to collect his son's bodies for burial. But he, too, was fatally wounded by a sniper. Rab's comment on this part: "They simply kept coming to try and get those bodies."
I mean, this just raises fundamental questions about basic human rights, about military rules of engagement, and, frankly, about ethics in warfare. The need for a dignified funeral to retrieve the body of a loved one, that's a basic human instinct. It's protected by international law. Yet, on that day, according to this investigation, it appears that love and grief were treated as reasons to kill. Rab described the area as a combat zone, where any military-age man was essentially marked for death. When asked how his squad decided whether to shoot unarmed Palestinians, he said, and this is a direct quote, "There is a line that we define. They don't know where that line is, but we know." That idea of an invisible line known only to those holding the guns, it's profoundly unsettling.
It really is. The footage of Salem's death was later posted online by another soldier, apparently. Rob confirmed that he and another sniper carried out 3 of these specific killings that day. The sequence of events described is just heartbreaking. After Muhammad was killed first, his cousin Yus ran to try and warn the brothers, which inadvertently led Salem into the line of fire, sealing his fate. Reb described on camera how he shot the teenager. And retrieving bodies, as you said, is protected by international law, even by Israeli army regulations, according to Isa Kasher, who actually co-wrote the IDF's Code of Ethics. The next victim was the father, Montasser. Then another cousin, Khalil, who tried to help Montasser after he was shot, was also shot, though he survived. Khalil recounted, "I'd taken about 8 to 10 steps carrying him when I was shot and felt as if my arm had been torn off." Montasser died in the hospital the next day. The bodies of the two brothers remained in the street until a ceasefire finally happened on November 24th. Khalil said, "Anyone who approached was shot." In total, Daniel Rab claims his sniper team killed 105 people by the end of his mission in Gaza.
Wow. Now, the Israeli army, it should be noted, has not responded to specific questions from the investigators about the Dugmos family killings. A spokesperson did state, more generally, that their forces operate in strict conformity with their rules of engagement and international law. However, international law experts consulted for the investigation argue that the available evidence, including the video and testimony, points towards a war crime. The surviving mother, Faya, reflecting on eventually seeing her son's bodies, said of the sniper raid, "Even if I forgive, God will not forgive him." It's just a devastating statement that underscores the deep moral wounds left by these kinds of actions.
What a journey we've taken today, really. From that high-stakes geopolitical chess game playing out in Eastern Europe and its ripple effects across the continent, to the passionate street protests in France reflecting those deep societal frustrations, and finally, landing on these incredibly raw, painful human stories emerging directly from Gaza. These aren't just separate headlines, are they? They feel like interconnected threads in the complex fabric of our world right now.
They really are. And these kinds of deep dives, I think they truly remind us of the immense complexity, the interconnectedness of it all. It's just so crucial to look beyond the surface, isn't it? To try and understand the diverse perspectives, the historical context, and maybe most importantly, the profound human impact behind every single conflict, every movement. The nuances we find in the sources, even the conflicting ones, are often where the most significant insights actually lie.
Indeed. We've explored these lines we define, haven't we? Whether it's in military engagement, in political discourse, or in humanitarian action. It makes you wonder, how do we as individuals, as a global community, understand and maybe even redefine those lines? Especially in an age where information is so fragmented, so easily manipulated. What responsibilities do those definitions, those lines in the sand, impose on all of us? Something to reflect on, perhaps. We certainly encourage you to keep questioning, keep exploring how narratives are constructed, presented, and perceived in these complex situations. Until next time.